Right, we'll try to proceed. Again, apologies to our audience for these technical difficulties. I think that it would be best if we proceed from the introduction and now invite our first speaker forward. And his name is Aftab Ahmed. And Aftab is a freelance columnist for a prominent Bangladeshi, for prominent Bangladeshi media outlets, with over 100 published articles for the Daily Star and the Dhaka Tribune newspapers. Aftab remains a keen analyst of South Asian politics, public policy making, developmental studies, culture, international relations, and economics. Born and raised in Bangladesh, Aftab came to Toronto as an international student in 2014 and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Toronto, double majoring in economics and international relations. He is currently employed as an investment consultant at the Toronto Dominion Bank. I would like to invite Aftab forward so that we can proceed with the presentations now. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel. Extremely humbled and privileged to be part of a panel comprising of experts and individuals who are much better versed than I am regarding the legacies of colonialism. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Fun fact, Professor Aisha Jalal was my go-to source of information when I was writing my papers back in university. So it indeed is a massive privilege for me to be part of today's event. So I will just share my screen, James, if that's okay, from my presentation. James, if that's okay. James, if you could enable the sharing screen for participants, that would be helpful. Thank you. All right, so. Right, there we go. All right. I hope you all can hear me. So in discussing the legacy of colonialism in Bangladesh and much more prominently in the subcontinent, I think there are various layers that one can discuss. But the focus of sort of my presentation will be regarding the lasting effects of colonial legal structures in modern Bangladesh. If we want to start to sort of analyze the history of British imperialism or British colonialism in Bangladesh or Bengal, as it was then, one has to start perhaps at the Battle of Plassey, 1757. A very critical moment in the history of the subcontinent, as the British East India Company was victorious against the last Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and which had an active betrayal of an interesting person by the name of Mir Zafar, who was Siraj-ud-Dowlah's commander-in-chief. And this battle and its victory essentially seized control of the subcontinent, Myanmar, Afghanistan, for the British. And I don't want to delve too much into this again, as this is not my area of expertise. But 1757, again, is a crucial period and time in the history of colonialism, as Bengal was annexed, and it sort of resulted in a larger takeover of the subcontinent, became a focal point in driving an industrial revolution. The region was very wealthy in Southeast Asia, and that's sort of where we start thinking about the effects of colonialism. But more specifically, the core of my presentation, as I said, will discuss the lasting effects of the legal structures or legal vehicles that the British left, and sort of discuss how that is still impacting modern independent Bangladesh as of today. So I'm just going to move to the next slide just to give you a brief idea about where Bangladesh stands currently as a country. The British left in 1947. From 1947 to 1971, Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. It's called East Pakistan. In 1971, Bangladesh acquired independence from Pakistan, and this year we celebrated 50 years of an independent Bangladesh. So in this slide, I've sort of given you a rough idea of where we stand from my perspective, at least. Bangladesh is currently a growing economy, a South Asian economic star with rapid GDP growth rates based on textile, agriculture, and remittances. It's sort of like the poster boy of economic growth in certain aspects, referred to by the World Bank, etc., for making credible progress across human development indicators, particularly across health metrics such as maternal mortality rate reductions and infant mortality rate reductions. Due to its geographical position, it is under threat from climate change. And as such, it has had to react as a nation and has become a regional leader in climate resiliency initiatives. And of course, I'm sure some of you might have heard about organizations such as Grameen Bank and BRAC, leading NGOs and sort of focal points of community-based entrepreneurism in the region, and an example to the world for instruments such as microcredit. So Bangladesh has indeed come a long way, undeniably, as a nation which is making progress. But again, there are concerns that remain ever present even today, and those concerns have their roots in colonialism, interestingly, and I'll go over that in details. So increasingly over the past 10 to 12 years, Bangladesh has witnessed an increasingly authoritarian political trend. You see lack of democratic activities and an increasingly controversial role for law enforcement agencies. The two most recent general elections were highly contested and criticized by international organizations. And that has also simultaneously led to a situation where press and social media freedom has been curtailed, and you are seeing growing human rights concerns. There are the other aspects of the economic journey and the path taken to development, such as an education system which still remains extremely colonial in nature, from how the syllabus and syllabi are constructed for primary and secondary education levels, as well as how examinations are undertaken. And of course, interestingly, Bangladesh now has the second highest growth of millionaires in the last year or so, which increasingly shows a level of inequality which is deeply concerning. So that's where Bangladesh stands as of right now as a country, if I am to put it briefly. And moving forward, as I mentioned, one of the primary concerns from a broader lens is in the state of democracy in the country as of right now, and the lack of democratic activities in the past 10 years or so. And I think the most prominent vehicle that the state or state based organizations and institutions have used or tapped into has been something called the Digital Security Act. The Digital Security Act is based on a colonial era Official Secrets Act. And the crux of it is this. You have a tool, a legal vehicle by which freedom of expression, freedom of free speech, and the freedom to talk essentially is being curtailed by law enforcement agencies. It has been used as a vehicle to curb dissent and democratic activities, similar, if not the same, as to how colonial regimes used the Official Secrets Act back in the 19th century. Just to give you some context, Parliament passed the Digital Security Act in September 2018. And what it did was it combined the colonial era Official Secrets Act with a new provisions such as arrests without a warrant. So interestingly and sadly, in fact, since 2019, the country has witnessed an increasing use of the DSA to curb dissent and to sort of arrest individuals, try individuals who have been vocal against issues that they have seen develop, and issues which they have, which people have raised concern against with respect to government decisions. In 2019, we saw 63 cases being lodged against journalists and particularly so-called free thinkers. 2020, the numbers went up. And 2021, at the heart of the pandemic, we increasingly saw individuals being arrested by leveraging the DSA. Prominent photojournalists such as Kajol, who depicted stories of corruption on mainstream newspapers, and senior writer Mushtaq Ahmed, in fact, died in prison while being arrested under what specialists and legal scholars are calling one of the last remaining remnants of the colonial era Official Secrets Act. So the point that I want to sort of focus on is this: the legacy of British colonial laws remain ever present in Bangladeshi society. Most notably and most recently, it was mobilized in 2018 via the development of the Digital Security Act, and such has raised immense concern across Bangladeshi society and across the legal community. Now, sort of the philosophical roots of the Digital Security Act, as I said, lies in something called the Official Secrets Act 1923, which was formulated in the colonial era in order to prevent what the British considered spying against the state, so what we call anti-state activities. But the Bangladeshi Constitution of 1972 guarantees freedom of expression as the fundamental right, and the Constitution is crafted in a way that fundamental rights supersede any and all laws of the land. Therefore, there is an increasing and growing movement amongst journalists in particular and individuals who are working in human rights organizations to mobilize a campaign against the political authority to rescind the Digital Security Act because of how colonial and how aggressive it is as a vehicle against democracy. And moving forward, I'd just like to give you a quick example. Rosina Islam is a senior journalist in Bangladesh. She writes for a paper, and she is an investigative journalist for a paper called Prothom Alo. In 2021, at the heart of the pandemic, she was investigating corruption in the health ministry. And on launching one of her investigations, she had visited an office, a health department office in Dhaka city. And she had sort of found out about massive levels of corruption undertaken by health ministry officials, which were later presented to the public. But in that very moment, she was arrested without a warrant, and she was arrested under the Official Secrets Act. Ultimately, Rosina Islam was released, but this was the first time in almost 35 years that the Official Secrets Act was actually used by the government of Bangladesh against an individual or citizen. And this remains a sad remnant of our colonial past. Moving forwards, as I said, democracy being in danger has also been associated with an increasing role of law enforcement agencies and the police in Bangladesh. Human Rights Watch has reported multiple, if not hundreds of cases. In fact, 572 people in Bangladesh in the last 11 years have been forcibly disappeared by the security forces and law enforcement agencies, who have often tapped into colonial era legal structures and rules to again arrest people without warrants and engage in something that the law enforcement agencies call crossfires or encounters between individuals. And of course, you have seen an increasing role of a secret police force called the Rapid Action Battalion. Again, extremely undemocratic, as Human Rights Watch has said, and along with other organizations. The basis of criminal justice laws in Bangladesh is the 1860 Penal Code. Again, just to give you an example, the 1860 Penal Code basically dictates, for example, according to one of its sections, the definition of rape. And up until last year, marital rape was not considered rape, which resulted in a lot of victims not being able to access judicial services and get the kind of justice that they were looking for. This remains an issue of contention because we have not, as a country, defined rape in a manner consistent with providing justice to the victims for the last 150 years. That's just one aspect of it. And again, as I said, the punishment for being a rapist in the eyes of the law was imprisonment for 10 years. That is being looked at right now. In fact, I think the government of Bangladesh has worked with legal scholars to ensure that sections of the 1860 Penal Code are addressed, but you could see that a major portion of how law enforcement agencies act in the country is still based on colonial era rules, which are outdated and have been deemed draconian in nature. And in a nutshell, that is where we stand. The legacy of British colonization is multifold in Bangladesh, but in my perspective, in my experience, and in my personal research as a columnist, what I've seen increasingly is the mobilization of colonial era rules and laws and legal vehicles which are being used to clamp down on dissent and are acting against the very principles of democracy that the country sort of tried to institutionalize over the last 50 years. It has been used by the state and by political actors as a means to ensure that they remain in power, unfortunately, and it is a trend that has remained present across different political regimes, not simply the current political regime. And there is a growing movement in Bangladesh for people to understand, reflect on the legacies of colonial laws, and as such, address them head on immediately. The last point that I would like to make on a lighter note is one of the things that the British did was inspire our artists and intellectuals to come together in a way to form sort of an anti-colonist movement in Bangladesh and Bengal. This was unique because artists and cultural icons undertook what we now call the Bengal Renaissance, radical transformation of subcontinental society, mobilized by poets and writers. And the reason I say this even today is that the individuals you see on the slide, or to the left, you will see Rabindranath Tagore, iconic literary figure, received the knighthood from the British Empire, rejected it because he was an anti-colonialist. We can go into a discussion regarding that some other day. But at the same time, also received the Nobel Prize for Literature. Qazi Nazrul Islam, national poet of Bangladesh, again, their songs and their poems remain ever constant in Bengali society even today. And a massive component of the work they did was their sort of vision for a free and independent subcontinent, in the sense that one that respects our culture, our rules, and our mediums of operation, and not be under the whims of colonialist forces. So again, the legacy of Bangladesh, the legacy of colonialism when it comes to Bangladesh is perhaps rooted in our legal sort of trajectory that the nation has taken over the past 50 years. The very constitution of the country is based on common law, and what British common law, and a large component of the criminal justice rules and regulations are based on the 1860 Penal Code and broader legislative and legal tools used by colonialist forces. And that remains a cause of concern, not simply for me, but for those people in Bangladesh who want to see democracy flourish. I believe the other speakers will talk about more important components such as the Bengal famine. I know Professor Aisha Jalal has done a lot of work on this, and I followed her over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think she can give us better context regarding partition, etc. But yeah, so that was me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Aftab. Very interesting to see how the British colonial influence still has an effect on the Bangladeshi legal system. And we'll be exploring that in lots more detail later on. And I would just like to remind our audience who are joining us on YouTube to use the comment section to ask any questions. And we will be having a panel discussion after the presentations have been completed. Thank you. One of our speakers is having some technical difficulties, so we will be moving to our third speaker, Aisha Jalal. And I'm just going to read Aisha's presentation, start again, her biography, before I invite her to unmute her microphone and begin her presentation. Aisha Jalal is the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, where she teaches at both the History Department and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She obtained her BA majoring in History and Political Science from Wellesley College, USA, and her doctorate in History from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Jalal has been a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Leverhulme Fellow at the Centre of South Asian Studies, Cambridge, Fellow of Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., and Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Between 1998 and 2003, she was a MacArthur Fellow. She has taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Tufts University, Columbia University, and Harvard University. Her publications include The Sole Spokesman, Jinnah, the Muslim League and the Demand for Pakistan, The State of Marital Rule, The Origin of Pakistan's Political Economy of Defense, and Democracy and Authoritarianism in South Asia, a Comparative and Historical Perspective. Dr. Jalal has co-authored Modern South Asia, History, Culture and Political Economy with Sugata Bose, or Sugata Bose, excuse if I'm mispronouncing, which has been published by Oxford University Press in India and by Sang-e-Meal in Pakistan. Her study of Muslim identity in the subcontinent, entitled Self and Sovereignty, the Muslim Individual and the Community of Islam in South Asia since around 1850, appeared in 2000 and 2001. She has authored Partisans of Allah, Jihad in South Asia. She has edited the Oxford Companion to Pakistani History and co-edited a bilingual Urdu and English volume entitled Manto, The Lawrence Stone lectures she gave at the Davis Center at Princeton University in April 2011 have been published as The Pity of Partition, Manto's Life, Times, and Work Across the India-Pakistan Divide. Dr. Jalal's most recent book is The Struggle for Pakistan, A Muslim Homeland and Global Politics. I would like to invite Dr. Jalal forward to begin her presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James. That was a very long introduction, but thank you for your generosity. I don't need one. But I know, as you know, I've been writing on partition for a long, long time. But I thought I'd begin personally and say to you that my first introduction to partition was through literature. I grew up in a home where the figure of Saadat Hasan Manto, the famous Urdu short story writer, was larger than life. He's my granduncle. I grew up with his daughters, my cousins. And so, I mean, one of the sort of things that I knew before I knew anything else was how to say "Apar de gurgurdi anks of the bitahana di mungi dal of the lantan," which is Toba Taksing. So I think I knew that before I could say the kalma, maybe. But I was very young, and my brothers and who were all older to me, they would talk about it. So, I wondered, and I heard about partition. There was evidence of material culture of partition. For instance, the house we lived in belonged to Hindus. We lived in something called Lakshmi Mansions. My father and my family would live upstairs, and Manto's family was downstairs. And there was this stone table that could not move with the Hindu family that left. And so that was a very sort of important presence of the past in our present. The persistence of that. So I actually started, when I started thinking about partition, I was really curious whether Manto's stories were just fiction or whether they were corroborated by the evidence that one could find. So while Manto sort of wrote about the human tragedy of partition, i.e. the consequences of partition, I was interested in establishing the causes of partition. And so, yes, my first book, The Sole Spokesman, Jinnah the Muslim League and the Demand for Pakistan, basically asked the question of why India was partitioned. And that was really a political question. And so I couldn't really access that answer by looking at human tragedy. So I think that so the questions we ask, determine how we proceed. But I did, after several years, after doing this work, did return to produce this book, The Pity of Partition, on Manto, returning to literature. So it was in many ways coming full circle from where I began with Manto. And so I just extracted a few things to share with you today, because I do think that literature and history juxtaposed together can give us a much fuller picture of what really transpired. There's high politics, and then there's the question of the human dimension, the tragedy that was partition. So let me just use a few of those. Whose blood is being shed with such heartlessness every day? Saadat Hasan Manto rude as he tried making sense of Independence Day celebrations in Bombay on August 14th, 1947. Pakistan and India had been declared separate countries. There was public rejoicing, cries of Hindustan Zindabad, Pakistan Zindabad, but they struck a discordant note with the frenzy of murder, rape, and arson that were being perpetrated in the name of religion. Confused and disoriented, Manto could not decide whether India or Pakistan were his homeland. Where would they burn or bury the bones from which the vultures had stripped off the flesh of religion, he asked. And now that we are free of servitude, what would the people of the subcontinent dream of now? Would they have their own slaves now? To each of these big questions, there was an Indian answer, a Pakistani answer, and a British answer. And I would today add that there is also a Bangladeshi answer today. The Batwara, or partition. Batwara is so much of it's literally division, but is used frequently in land demarcations. So the Batwara, this is how Manto referred to partition. I mean, it may have divided lives and drawn lines of blood in the hearts and minds of people, but the arbitrary lines drawn by the British on the map were not visible to anyone's eye. Some things could never be divided, he noted, like the common literary heritage. And Aftab very eloquently just talked about the common heritage of Bengal in Tagore and Qazi Nazrul Islam, and much more. I mean, how can you divide literary heritage? And not to mention bonds of friendship, which sort of prevail over religious and political divisions. The pity of partition, as Manto emphasized, was not that instead of one country, there were now two, independent India and independent Pakistan, but that human beings in both countries were slaves, slaves of bigotry, slaves of religious passions, slaves of animal instincts and barbarity. That was the real pity of partition. And that is the real pity of partition. Baffled by the furies let loose by the advent of a much wanted freedom, Manto left Bombay in January of 1948 for Lahore with more questions than answers. Should we wash our hands of humanity? Have we lost faith in that thing called conscience? He wondered. Partition's unpardonable horrors were a blot on the face of humanity. The fanfare of official nationalisms covered up the tragedy of partition, with the result that human bestiality was finding perfect ground for nurture to become ever more audacious in its expression. There were people who had committed murder and were deemed to be quote unquote heroes of their community rather than condemned. This is what was going on. Not a day passed, he noted, without a human being being killed by a fellow human being. Why are these few individuals so murderous? And why are their hearts and minds so possessed by murder and violence, he wondered. The fundamental questions that Manto asked through his writings, both fictional and non-fictional, about the nature of the post-colonial transition continue to resonate with us, something that Aftab again has outlined very beautifully with the legal aspect. I would throw in just about everything else, Aftab, take the police as well. I mean, just about the idioms have outlasted partition. So, you know, the fundamental questions that he asked, I think, continue to be relevant today as we try, I think, rather unsuccessfully to negotiate the ghost of partition in the 21st century. Weren't the basic problems confronting Indians, Pakistanis, or for that matter, Bangladeshis the same? Was Urdu going to become extinct in India? And what form would it take in Pakistan? Would Pakistan become a religious theocratic state? Would loyalty to the state confer citizens the right to criticize the government? I mean, the paradox of freedom, or the multiple paradoxes of freedom that Manto was pointing to, you know, I mean, his discerning literary gaze was pointing to, has mutated over the past 7.5 decades into bewildering permutations and combinations. Partition may have become a distant memory for many, and its invocations and public discourse limited to scoring points on the grid of patriotism. But its absent presences, this is what I really wanted to emphasize, in everyday life across the Great Divide of 1947, are indicators of its historical significance, not merely as an event that occurred 75 years ago, but a process that is very much part of our present. It's an ongoing process. As we speak, partitions are happening in our minds and in our hearts. It's an ongoing process with neither end nor beginning. Partition structures the entire post-colonial South Asian experience. How? It's an institutionalized form of dividing and disconnecting. Partition has been the founding myth of post-colonial nation states in South Asia. It ferrets out people, communities, and linguistic cultures that were once historically indivisible. If there are multiple slippages, elisions, and contestations and narratives about the Great Divide in official discourse, something that occurred 75 years ago, there are extraordinarily strange, awkward silences about its constant reenactments in the post-colonial nation states of South Asia. What do I mean? I'm referring to that ghost of partition that continues to haunt over Indian Muslims in India. The fact that on a constant basis, it's not that you are dividing up India, but within India, partitioning is taking place by creating boundaries within. Those are far more dangerous than the boundaries without. So I think it's that internal process of ferreting out, dividing. It's a way of thinking. That is how partition has structured our thinking. And I think it needs to be, if we are to exercise the ghost of partition, we are going to have to accept that partition as a way of thinking is a problem. I often tell my students at the Fletcher School that insofar as partition as a form of political arrangements is meant to be a conflict management issue, it has made conflict resolution impossible. So as a modality of solving problems of this world, I think partition of India is paradigmatic. There's lots to learn from it. And the first thing is to also go beyond it, but let's actually face the realities. One of the great misconceptions is that this all happened because of religion. And I think that's one of the things we need to put to rest and understand that, yes, it was human bestiality let loose by political decisions, but which were about politics, which were about power sharing for the most part. And so, I mean, I would just conclude, and I mean, I'd much rather have an interactive session with all of you, and just conclude by saying that these silences that we have, they need to be identified. I mean, this is what we need to talk about, rather than let partition divide us, because that is exactly what has been happening. If we are to overcome this problem, we all need to, and I'm so glad to see youth here, younger people here. It's you who are going to take this forward. So I'll just stop here, James. I'm happy to talk more, but I think I'd really much rather hear you all and then chat with you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jalal. Very fascinating. And as you've just mentioned, we will be having a panel discussion once we've finished our presentation. So very much looking forward to that.
Thank you.
I would now like to invite our next speaker forward. I'll be sharing her presentation, and her name is Poonam Kaur, and she's an actress and activist. She has served as a peace ambassador between India and Pakistan and has spoke about peace between the two nations. She advocates for interfaith dialogue, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing her presentation today. So I'll just screen share.
James, before we start off the presentation, can you just put up one picture of me and my mom out there, the one which I shared? Is that okay with you? Would you be able to do that?
I wasn't able to get that from my WhatsApp. If I can share that after your presentation, is that okay?
Okay, hi. Hello, everyone. As he said, I'm Poonam, and this is the first time I'm in a formal chat about peace between the nations. And Aisha ma'am and everybody else who's out there, I know you've been into academics, have been speaking about it for a long time. But as a girl from Sikh community and as a person reads Ardas every day, we've always been told, and I really, really fairly remember my father saying when before he expired, I think I was just 4 or 5 years old, that even if I'm born, you've got to take your mother to Nankana Sahib. Now, that's a very, very emotional statement which my dad made, and it stuck on to me from then until now. And it took me 28 years since then for me to take my mom there. I did not know how, I did not know why. But since childhood, there are 2 subjects that I actually really, really worked on. I always thought that I had my ancestors on the other side, but when will I be able to see them? Always thought that I want to go and pray there, but when will I be able to do that? Is it fear which was stopping us? Is it the political benefit on the other side which was stopping us? And with this quest, I crossed the border and started really talking about peace and interfaith. And that's when I was questioned. I was also told by the Gurdwara, Bangla Sahib, and people there that don't try speaking something where you will be subjected to something which is very unfortunate. I said, when I'm advising peace and when it's the land of Guru Nanak, I think something positive would really, really happen. I did go there, I was questioned. And that very, very moment when I was actually recording the Gurdwaras, Panja Sahib and Kana Sahib, there were a lot of people who just surrounded me and said, why are you doing this? And that's exactly when I felt the divide. I was not allowed to video record my own Gurdwara. I said I was okay to talk to the seniors there and say that not many people in my family will be able to do what I am doing. And it is a promise made to my father. But luckily on the same day, when I prayed, the next day, it's a lot of coincidence and a lot of blessing if you people believe in the supreme power, that Kartarpur corridor was announced. And I was allowed to make amazing videos on the Gurdwaras, and I was allowed to go to the temple there. Now that we're coming to the subject of it, and I was lucky to be called as a peace ambassador there and advocating peace. So something, where there's a will, they say there's a way. I think people like us should come together to advocate peace because that is the only way forward. Now, Sikhism and colonization. According to Stanford University, the definition of colonialism is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. Therefore, from the very definition, it is clear that colonialism is not altruistic in nature at all. Rather, it's based on the philosophy of exploitation completely. Colonialism in Punjab. The region of Punjab is perhaps one of the most exploited in colonial India. Although there were some incidental benefits in terms of canal work and railway infrastructure, however, there were unintended consequences of the colonial project consolidating their power in the region and exploiting as much economic resources as possible. It's particularly important to note, Punjab has paid rather a much heavy price in terms of human life and sufferings. Whether it was world wars or partition, the human cost was immense. Even after partition, India, part of Punjab, continued to suffer due to proxy war that some way or the other connects it into the colonial past and facing it. Sikhs are one of the worst sufferers of colonial legacy. The division of Punjab also divided their most sacred sites, as I said, Nankana Sahib. Adding to partition led to migrate from their ancestral places. History, plunders and blunders. Division of land, also the source. The Indian Councils Act 1909, commonly known as Minto-Morley reforms, was an act of parliament of the United Kingdom. Apart from doing other things, it precipitated the divide and the rule policy that the colonial government started after the 1857 rebellion. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate, which was really bad. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, the act legalized communalism. However, it was just the start of the philosophy that colonial government was following. It wanted to rule India by any means. Government of India Act 1919 further enlarged the scope of separate electorate and included Sikhs and Anglo-Indians and other in its fold. Therefore, further communalizing the nation. The objectives of Britishers were very clear. The whole nation was going to pay the price, such as vicious British policies. Punjabization of the army and partition of India 1947. The land revenue system, people of Punjab. The Mahalwari system was introduced in 1833 during the period of William Bentinck. The British land tax system as a whole has had a disastrous effect. Initially, land was used to generate income. Land is considered private property, which is unprecedented. Due to high taxes, farmers have to produce cash crops instead of food crops. This caused famine and food shortages. The farmer owes the money lender's debt because the tax must be paid in cash and later becomes the landowner. The peasants became bonded laborers. When India gained independence, only 7% of villagers, called zamindars, controlled 75% of their land. World wars. A portion of the service records more than 3.2 lakh troops from undivided Punjab, who fought the British Army in the First World War, have been digitized by UK historians. Punjab sent more than 5 lakh soldiers to the World War I, comprising a third of all Indian troops and more than other Commonwealth territories such as Australia. All of us know what Jallianwala Bagh And civil unrest during 1947-48, loss of lives, livelihood, families, and much more. Division of Sikh heritage. We still don't know how many of us will be able to go and pray there due to the proxy wars for the political benefits. When it comes to environment, yes, canal colonies. Punjab is a land of Indus Valley civilization, one of the oldest or the oldest urban civilization. However, particular type of philosophy, subjugation of nature to the will of the man, transformed the whole region irreversibly. For creating canal colonies, a large swatch of forests were cut, and that have changed the topography of the whole region. Now, railways. Entire forests, thousands of trees were cleared to provide timber to underlay the new railway tracks that would carry the freshly harvested wheat and cotton to the port to feed the British machine. It was brutal transformation of the landscape of the region, cropping pattern. Because of the change in land revenue system and other reasons, the whole cropping was transformed, damaged the ecosystem of Punjab. Where are we now? It is left in a constant fight with our own identities. Are we Punjabi first, or from the religion or the region? It left us paralyzed and fragmented. Once the well-integrated region is now the least connected region of the world. It has socio-economic, political, environmental consequences. You have to go to the next slides. Next slide. I am done with it. Yes, the conclusion part, we definitely know this, yeah. Citizen-centric policies, which is very, very important. I may cite an example of when I went to take the visa for Pakistan, the second time when I was actually invited officially. I went into the office and there they placed, and everyone really knows that I was coming for a visa so that I and my mother can visit the Holy Shrine. It was not needed for somebody from the embassy to place a book of Kashmir in front of me. They just placed it in front of me and asked, what do you think about this? I said, all that I seek for is peace. All that I seek for is forgiving. All that I seek for is moving forward. All that I seek for is now for us and the brother who was in front of me. Then they allowed me to move forward. We need to have citizen-centric policies. Focus on geoeconomics. It's very unfortunate that a large portion of our money is going for the proxy wars. And maybe the issues are not resolved because of the economics part of it. But we have to find a way out. Humanity. In Hindi, I should say, हुकूमत की जगह शायद इंसानियत नहीं होती, लेकिन इंसानियत हुकूमत थोड़ी करने लगे तो शायद इंसानियत बच जाए. Accepting the new realities. We need to accept what's happening. We need to understand that there cannot be a full-on war between India and Pakistan. What is the way out? Will I see my brothers on either sides of the border dying every day? I practice tying Rakhi to each one of them. I have my friends across the border. And the only thing I say from the Ardas, prayers so that we all can have a border of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poonam. And Arti, can I just ask you to share your screen so that we can see the image that Poonam was referring to earlier, please?
It's saying that I have the host has to disable the participant screen sharing.
I can show it on the phone if you're unable to do it.
Poonam, it might be best if you're able to share it on the phone. That might be the best. Apologies again for these technical.
No, that's all right. That's completely okay. Well, this is much more than just going to Pakistan. It showcases to me a promise given to my dad and kept. Now I am able to, okay. I can't. That's my mom and me at Kartarpur. Thanks. And that's about every Sikh girl and the community and the family who want to go and visit there. And I hope this happens with all of you. James, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. And Aisha ji and everybody else, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Poonam, and I enjoyed listening to some of your information about colonization and some of the conversations about modern day relations between India and Pakistan. It's definitely something we can pick up during our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I would now like to invite our fourth speaker to come forward. I'll read the biography and then invite Irfan Polani to deliver his presentation. Mr. Irfan Polani is an independent peace-building researcher working to resolve the Kashmir conflict. He had founded a project called the Kashmir Journal in August of 2019, and it documents ground realities from the valley, intending publication as a series of books in 2024. He's also an aspiring lawyer based in New Delhi and has a peace scholar from the global campus of the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Polani has been awarded with the Tata Trust's 1947 Partition Archive Research Grant last year and was also selected to the cohort of Rajiv Circle Fellowship run by California-based Motwani Jadeja Foundation. He recently attended the Global Peace Summit in 2022 held in Dubai as a delegate representing India. Irfan, I'd like you to unmute your microphone and begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, James, for this warm welcome. Good evening, everyone from New Delhi. I'm so glad to be here at this event. As James was saying, I'm still a student. I'm still a final year student of law at the University of Delhi. And more than being a speaker or a contributor to this forum, what I was seeking was to enhance my knowledge from eminent speakers panel, including Madam Aisha, Aftab Bhai, and my friend Poonam, and many other speakers to speak. So I'm so grateful to be here today. So as James was saying, I'm currently running an independent peace building research project, which I initiated from my university back in 2019. So I am going to speak a little bit about the historical perspective on Kashmir dispute, how the British colonization or even the partition has a relevant influence on today's situations in Kashmir. And more than a historical analysis, I'm trying to put up some of my suspicions, which I'm trying to authenticate through my research. So as we know, there are often infinite debate arguments, both on the positive and negative impacts of the British colonization of the Indian subcontinent. And some of the impacts were positive for India, but most of them resulted from British imperial interests being prioritized over domestic interests. Although many of their influences were officially brought to an end upon the independence in August 1947, it is apparent that the extended period of foreign control had impacts that persist in modern day India. I could relate the same thing what Aftab was speaking about, the continued legacies of the legal history and the legal structure of today's Bangladesh, and what Madam Aisha was saying, like we experience and we see that even in today's legal establishments of India. As a law student myself, I know the Indian Penal Code itself is a contribution from the British, and again, bringing the entire Indian subcontinent under the control of one central government presided over by the British Parliament in London is the most widely claimed change for the region. And it had historically consisted of only a weak collection of distinctly separate districts with considerably separate economic systems. As the Indian sociologist Andre Bitterle had written, the universities established by the Raj opened new horizons, both intellectually and institutionally, in a society that had stood still in a conservative and hierarchical mold for centuries. But it should be noted with importance that even if the British had this credit for politically uniting, as they say, it has destroyed 100 times, I may say, when they went away by partitioning our motherland, splitting the worlds and lives of people, that too on a theory, the two nation theory, eventually installing a never ending hatred between the communities and pushing to the long loop of underdevelopment, as far as I understand. The greatest of reparations that the British still offers to India or the Indian subcontinent should be for their inglorious brokerage of the 1947 partition. There are floating opinions that it was the popular demand of time. The situation in the political spectrum of British India was demanding that, and even Gandhi or the then mighty Congress couldn't stop it. But honestly, even before and now, during my humble efforts of decoding the legacies of partition, I am eventually realizing that it was an impiously engineered event by the so-called empire whose sun never set. Let's go to the why part later. And anyone who has an idea about the political history of Kashmir would agree on, like whatever we say, the bloodbath of partition in Punjab, the horrific brutalities on the sidelines of Bengal partition, the storm had one or the other way calmed in these two regions after 70 and 5 years of the incident. But Kashmir is an unentered, unresolved, and magnificently chaotic byproduct of the British partition of India. After the First Anglo-Sikh War, the Treaty of Amritsar was signed in 1846 between the British East India Company and Raja Gulab Singh, giving birth to the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. The British demanded a compensation of 7.5 million Indian rupees from Sikhs. They could not pay. Gulab Singh did and got the Kashmir Valley in return with an acceptance of overall British sovereignty. So one can only say since then J&K was an ally. The Jammu Kashmir was an ally of the British, which was technically an independent princely state, but its administration ran under the supervision of British Crown. So again, there was no direct influence of British imperialism in Jammu and Kashmir then. And also by the early 1947, the British had made it clear to the princes that a concept of Princestan would not happen. Each ruler would have to choose to join India or Pakistan and need to make an accession. However, a few princely states wanted to behold their decisions and even thought of becoming independent. Two significant and controversial accessions involving the princely state of Junagadh and Hyderabad set precedents to enable India and Pakistan to engage in duplicity, double standards, and diatribes in relation to what was to become the Kashmir dispute. The Junagadh situation particularly created some interesting and really dangerous precedents in relation to Jammu and Kashmir's later accession to India. Amongst the many dilemmas faced by the Maharaja Hari Singh of Kashmir, the heaviest one was the Kashmiri linkage to the place that was to become Pakistan. They were connected economically, socially, and they were even having cultural ties. For example, the town of Rawalpindi, it was so nearby town to Jammu Kashmir, and they were depending on the town as it had a railway access. And similarly, the Sialkot town, it was dependent to the residents of Jammu, and also the dependency of Jammu Kashmir people to the town, Jhelum town. There are multiple examples which we can focus and list. So despite the standstill agreement with Pakistan, the Jammu Kashmir's dependency on Pakistani Punjab was highlighted in September 1947 when the supply of essential goods and services to Jammu Kashmir, including petrol, wheat, and salt, was severely curtailed. This may have been an act of intimidation by Pakistan, but post-partition, however, the odds of India obtaining Jammu and Kashmir improved. The British had constituted two formal boundary commissions in 1947 with Sir Cyril Radcliffe as the chairman of both. The barrister's attributes for this major cartographical challenge appear to be his total lack of knowledge of or interest in India. Radcliffe had never been to the subcontinent before, nor would he return after the completed boundary work. Instead, he was a legal surgeon who the British brought to India solely to sever the subcontinent into two independent dominions. And let me also remind that this all are my mid research feelings, and these are not the concluded conclusion of my research, or might not be even fully true, but I'm just sharing this as a student on a student perspective. In 17 August 1947, the possibility of Jammu Kashmir joining India improved significantly after the Radcliffe Boundary Commission contentiously awarded India the narrow and strategic Gurdaspur land corridor. Even some Pakistanis saw Gurdaspur allocation to India as a conspiracy because Gurdaspur district had a 51% of Muslim majority population. They all say it should have been awarded to Pakistan. But when it comes to the Jammu Kashmir's future, the general consensus among the British Indians, Pakistanis, most leading Jammu Kashmir politicians, probably many of the people of Jammu Kashmir, and later the United Nations, was that Jammu and Kashmir and should ultimately and its entirety join either India or Pakistan. This zero-sum game in which one nation would get all of the Jammu Kashmir and the other would get nothing would be a significant impediment resolving the Kashmir dispute. I would need another episode to articulate the brief examples from British imperialistic influence on the present day conflict situations in Kashmir. But all the ambiguities in divisions, the intended partiality from the British authorities had resulted in the partition to be so horrific and wild. And as Madam Professor Aisha Jalal was also mentioning, the sense of partition or the victimhood of partition is still haunting many households, many elder households in India, and the social situations, particularly in India. If you observe recent days, there has been wide discussions about the the social unrest that's happening all over the country. And I some or the other way I get this instinct to connect it with to the partition, the lack of communal harmony in present day India. I somehow feel like it can have a loose link to what happened during the partition and all. So I'm about to conclude what I'm speaking here right now. But as I got the opportunity to do a specific research through the 1947 Partition Archive on the topic, the impacts of partition in Jammu Kashmir, I realized, like, I had the opportunity to view and to listen and to understand the first-hand witness records from the last generation of survivors of partition and the witnesses of partition. And it was so fascinating and mind-blowing to see that many of the people in Jammu Kashmir, whether they be common people of that time or let them be the political leaders of that time, they were not only opposing the partition of India, but they were really standing for an idea of a united subcontinent. So it was really fascinating for me. Like, we have an image and a notion of present day Kashmiris as they are separatists, so they want to escape both India and Pakistan, and they want to establish independence or whatever as they say. But this fact, and this was the recorded interviews which I got a chance to view, and it was so mind-blowing. And again, one more point which I would like to place here is the suspicion behind the Mountbatten Diaries of 1947, which British author Andrew Lowndes on a legal journey and a legal procedure to get the personal diaries of the last Viceroy of India, Mountbatten. And hopefully that diary, it has been declassified, and it has not been given to the public, but it was preserved. So we really suspect that there would be some notices and records about their unhealthy aim in partitioning the country. So that's all I have to say. As I was saying, I started an independent research project on Kashmir 3 years back. On the very same day, the central government of India abrogated a constitutional special status which was given to the Jammu Kashmir state, and like it eventually turned into an independent peace building research from a discussion forum in my university, and still I'm in the process of that research. I'm trying to get as far as ground testimonies from the last elder generations in Kashmir. And this humble study I initiated has been undertaken for last 3 years, and had made me realize the relevance of British interests in partition of the country, which later nurtured this grievance conflict in Kashmir. I'm still authenticating my understanding and research findings with a lot of historical evidence and blending it with the concepts of international law to reinstate the Kashmiriyat, or what we say, the feeling of harmony between Kashmiri communities. So I'm also volunteering for an organization founded by a former judge of the Supreme Court of India, and we advocate for peace and unity in the Indian subcontinent, particularly between the erstwhile states of British India. So let's see how this journey gets along for all of our incredible initiatives in studying the global impacts of one of the mightiest empires in history. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Irfan, and I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. I think it's very important, as you said, to get hold of that primary source material so that we can better inform our understanding of the legacies of, as you say, one of the largest empires that we've seen in human history. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Updesh Singh. Updesh is an establishing creative and filmmaker with a background in politics and international relations. Currently, his research is focused on identifying and assessing the impacts of the British Raj on the Sikh Punjabi community and how these have manifested in the present day. Updesh, I would like to invite you to unmute your microphone and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Hey, nice to see everyone. Thank you for having me on. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so 1 second. Sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties right now. Give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, I think I'm just gonna have to do it like this. Sorry. So my presentation today is going to be on the impacts of the British Empire on the Sikh community specifically. So just to start off the talk, I wanted to briefly introduce who the Sikhs are in a sense. And the Sikh way of life was founded in the late 15th century by Guru Nanak Dev Ji, the first Guru. The term Sikh itself can be defined as to learn. And one of the main focuses of a Sikh would be to seek the timeless truth. Following the martyrdom of the fifth Guru, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, by the Mughal Empire, the Sikhs became heavily militarized as a population under the command of the sixth Guru, Guru Har Gobind Ji. And then following this, like the preceding years after that, there would be ongoing conflicts between various political powers such as the Hil Raja, as well as the Mughal Empire itself and the Sikhs themselves, where several battles were then fought between the Mughal Empire and the Sikhs. This ultimately led to the formation of the Khalsa in 1699 by the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh Ji, which is essentially a community of initiated Sikhs who dedicate their lives to protecting and serving those who do not necessarily have the means to do so themselves. And this is a community that still operates and exists to this day. So yeah, that's just like a very brief introduction into who the Sikhs are. The Sikh Empire was actually something that followed in the late 18th century. So the 18th century saw the collapse of the Mughal Raj in Punjab at the time, and then it saw the rise of the Sikh Confederacy. As a result of that, the empire began, the Sikh empire itself, I should say, began with the capture of Lahore by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The following decades of of Ranjit Singh's rule saw that the people of the region prospered economically and culturally, and the rule itself was relatively secular in the sense that people from any communities, any backgrounds were given the opportunity to rise to positions of prominence. However, following the death of Ranjit Singh, turbulent times fell upon the empire, with many members of the royal family dying under suspicious circumstances, and then the outbreak of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. These wars were fought pretty brutally between the two powers, but it ultimately led to the annexation of the Sikh Raj by the British. And as you can see, that so the pictures I have here, this is Maharaja Ranjit Singh himself, and you can see that the control that the Sikh Empire had spans vastly across West and East Punjab as well. I did want to just make a little disclaimer here, the trigger warnings, that some of the following slides will contain depictions and descriptions of atrocities that were carried out by the British against members of the Sikh Empire. Yes, I just wanted to give a brief warning. I first wanted to start off talking about Bhai Maharaj Singh. So Bhai Maharaj Singh was a prominent Sikh leader during the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and then also after. He was one of the few commanders who refused to surrender to the British rule and had actually implemented a plan to reinstate Sikh rule in the region. However, he was informed on and subsequently arrested by the British Empire. Now, following their investigations, the British had determined that it would be way too dangerous to keep Maharaj Singh imprisoned in Punjab at the time. Macleod, the then Commissioner of India, had reported, "I am convinced that Maharaj Singh is a remarkable person. He has all the attributes of a saint. He has an unusual self-control and self-confidence. He seems to have power to foresee the coming events and has qualities of a great leader whom people would like to obey." So as such, when they imprisoned him and then they exiled him to Singapore, the majority of their the incarceration that he then was subjugated to was actually a confinement in a cell with the windows bricked up, and no opportunities were given to go outside and exercise. He was literally kept in that cell for the remainder of his days. And despite many doctors recommending that they allow him the occasional walk in the open, the government of India actually rejected this proposal, and as such, his health continued to deteriorate. After 3 years of this imprisonment, Maharaj Singh had actually lost his sight, and several other ailments had developed. And the reason I wanted to focus on this specific example was this is almost like an example that could be used to showcase the wider treatment of the British Empire on any peoples who have ever resisted their rule. This was done to crush the spirit of Bhai Maharaj Singh, and as such, it's a particularly extraordinary example of cruelty from the British Empire. There was no reason for them to keep someone locked up in a prison cell with the windows blocked up. The next example I want to talk about was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So this massacre actually took place a mere 5 months after the end of World War I, which saw thousands of millions of Indian soldiers, but also thousands of Sikh soldiers participating and also dying as well. And the actual massacre itself took place on the 13th of April in 1919, which also was Vaisakhi, the day that Sikhs celebrate to commemorate the birth of the Khalsa. In the lead up to the massacre, tensions were really high in the region with the increased agitation against the British Raj. Specifically, there was growing dissent as a result of the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the state to prosecute political cases without juries and permitted the internment of suspects without trial. It was proclaimed by Dyer and others in the administration, that crowds of more than 4 people in the city of Amritsar had been banned. However, this notice was not well disseminated throughout the area, and as such, people had still congregated to celebrate. Firstly, to celebrate Vaisakhi, as we do, where we have fairs and festivals, and we have large gatherings. But also, secondly, to some groups had peacefully congregated to peacefully protest the deportation of 2 nationalist leaders who were seen as dissenters by the officers in charge. This man on the right, as you can see, is Reginald Dyer. He is the person who essentially ordered this this attack or massacre. He actually made no attempts to peaceably disperse the crowd in this enclosed bog, which is essentially like a garden. So it's a walled garden with a few different exits. So he had actually blocked up the exits and sent troops in to where and basically cornered the people that were there, left them no routes of escape. And he did this with the intent to punish the Indians for their disobedience. And when the order to fire was given, his troops were ordered to fire into the densest parts of the crowds so as to inflict the maximum number of casualties on the people who were there. The British government subsequently tried to suppress the information about this massacre and actually initially reported it as a violent clash between rebels and authorities. Dyer was not court-martialed or treated as a murderer, as he was deemed to have been acting upon the orders of the military and essentially was not really court-martialed for that. Next slide. So the next example I wanted to bring up was the Rawalpindi experiments, and these were carried out before and during the Second World War, starting in the 1930s. They did last for more than 10 years. And it was essentially where British scientists from Porton Down used mustard gas on hundreds of Indian soldiers from the Indian Army. The scientists at Rawalpindi sent British to Indian soldiers wearing shorts and cotton shirts into gas chambers to experience the effects of mustard gas. The scientists hoped to determine the appropriate dosage to use on battlefields, essentially. Many of the subjects suffered severe burns and from the exposure of this gas. The interesting thing about this is Porton Down is actually a military installation in the UK that still operates to this day. And actually Porton Down officials, since this story broke, have since actually argued that seeing that these trials took place in a different era during a conflict, therefore we can't really judge that by today's standards, which I find as almost as a recurring theme when it comes to assessing the impacts of the British Empire. So from there, I wanted to move on to post-independence India. So India is essentially a colonial project, and it actually remains fractured still to this day due to the various sectarian tensions that were extremely exacerbated by the British rule. One of them, and this is particularly true for people in Punjab, especially the Sikhs as well. For example, the language has been suppressed by the Indian government in certain parts of our history. There was oppression and subversion of the Sikh faith itself that was due to various government legislation. And I also wanted to highlight that India has one of the highest numbers of active separatist groups as a nation. And I think that is a result of many different peoples from India not feeling represented by the nation itself. So as a result of those separatist groups, India has actually introduced various laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which essentially gives military personnel free rein to do whatever they need without fear of prosecution. And these laws and acts have been highly criticized by various human rights organizations, and the UN has actually, in fact, asked the Indian government to revoke this act, as it's been cited as undemocratic. So yeah, moving on from there, I want to briefly talk about Operation Blue Star. So just as like a brief disclaimer, this is a really complicated topic, and there are a multitude of different factors at play here that are really difficult to really go into in just a minute. So I wanted to just focus on the British aspect itself. So to briefly explain what Operation Blue Star was, it was a military operation that was carried out in early June 1984. And it was essentially carried out to remove various Sikh leaders and their followers from the Harmandir Sahib complex, which is actually the holiest shrine for Sikhs as a nation, as a community. The army actions had actually led to the deaths of at least 5,000 people, which they have highly contested to this day. Various estimates put this number as higher, but I think the average is that it's at least 5,000 people. The reason I want to talk about this specific example was because the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, had actually supported the actions of the Indian government by not only sending military advisors to aid in the planning and the execution of the operation itself, but then also in the suppression of protests that followed the operation from the Sikh community. And she had an overwhelming support for the then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. So in the present day, I want to kind of bring up that, so from Operation Blue Star to the actions of India, but then also the wider actions of the British Empire, the present day, we can see that the impacts of empire are still felt to this day. And actually the government of Britain still acts in a way that is detrimental to the Sikh community. For example, there have been several cases in the UK where members of the diaspora of the Sikh community in the UK have been targeted by police raids. I wanted to bring up the case of Jagtar Singh Johal, who is a British national who has been imprisoned since 2017 without charge and has actually been subjected to various methods of torture for, I'm not even sure what crime he's actually been accused of, but I did want to highlight that his arrest wasn't necessarily an arrest in India. He had a hood thrown over his head and he was thrown into the back of a van, so no due process, and he hasn't been given any due process since then. And there have been various actions by various MPs here in the UK who have called for a higher sense of urgency from the UK government to do something on his behalf to kind of get him back home. But that has been largely ignored by the established power in the UK. I also wanted to highlight that Boris Johnson has recently set up an anti-extremist task force to deal with extremist Sikh elements in the UK at the behest of the Indian government, which I think is heavily damaging from the UK to support essentially a foreign country's interests against British citizens. And I see it as highly undemocratic. And I think that when we actually kind of assess this as a legislation that the Boris Johnson has now put forward, it will actually probably lead to an increased risk to anyone here who tries to speak out against any sort of atrocities being committed in India in any way. But essentially, I wanted to like conclude that from the legacies of empire itself have been largely negative for the Sikh community, but also the wider Indian population. From the decimation of the Indian textiles industry to the Bengal famine, Britain's legacy in the subcontinent has led to generational trauma that many Indians to this day still have to deal with. This isn't necessarily just isolated to the Sikh community, but it is particularly true for the Sikh community, as you can see in the treatment of our community leaders as well as other prominent figures to the identity crisis that we've been dealing with over the last 100 years. And also even with partition, which is again another complicated topic that I myself decided not to speak about today, but partition saw the loss of the historic Sikh homeland and the loss of access to historic Sikh sites from India to Pakistan. I also wanted to highlight that Britain's legacy in India saw that communal tensions were highly exacerbated by the Raj itself, which we then still deal with to this day. And personally, I think the different communities from the Indian subcontinent, that includes Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, we really need to, as a whole, reconcile with the impacts of empire and try and start dialogues to kind of bridge these gaps that were widened by the British, and hopefully try and build a more peaceful subcontinent. Thank you. That's my talk for today. And thank you, James, for having me on.
Thank you very much, Abdesh. That was a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it, and we'll have some more discussions during our panel conversation later. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite our final speaker forward to deliver her presentation. I will just read her biography. So Sri Lagna Majumdar is a master's student of history at Jadavpur University, Kolkata, India. She is an aspiring archivist and a partition studies enthusiast. She has worked with the 1947 Partition Archive and Stanford University at the Partition Museum, Amritsar, for interviewing partition witnesses. Through her work in various museums and archives, she strives to get a wider perspective of gender relations in the global South and public history of modern India. Sri Lagna is also a part-time book reviewer and a full-time animal lover. Sri Lagna, I'd like to invite you forward to deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for inviting me to this talk. I would like to thank all of the speakers here. I loved listening to all of the speeches, and without wasting much time, I would share my screen. Is it visible, James?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Yes, we can see now, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. What I would try to do is I would try to briefly contextualize the experience of Bengalis during the partition of 1947 within the framework of a larger history. I personally believe that a view towards partition can never be mono-perspective. There's a constant presence of little bits of partition in people's minds. Even though when we look at Bangladesh, there seems to be a stronger focus on the events of the Liberation War of 1971. People from both West Bengal and Bangladesh are aligned to a Bengali national identity and cling on to their own food habits and customs. I would also like to highlight upon the gradual conceptualization of the religious other that grew post-partition. The Hindus and the Muslims were not perceiving each other's identities the same way that they have been doing before, because post-partition, the way they perceived each other changed dramatically. Before that, they have been living harmoniously in various nooks and corners of South Asia. So I would also like to give a trigger warning here, because I have used a couple of images which might be disturbing to some. This is how India and Bengal looked before 1947. So we can see that both East and West Bengal, they have been together. They're adjoined here, and which was not the case post-partition. The descendants of the urban migrants in Bengal record a greater sense of loss of property and business on one hand, and a deeper sense of cultural loss on the other, as their families moved from an urban milieu to the backwaters of East Bengal. Many Bengalis who had to leave everything in East Bengal and had to uproot themselves from their homeland still feel that food and festivals are better observed in Bangladesh. I have been working as a citizen historian under the 1947 Partition Archive, which is supported by the Stanford University. And I have observed while interviewing the partition witnesses, I have observed that the women respondents have had more stories to tell, especially regarding the private sphere of their lives, and their narratives were more graphic. It kind of seemed that the women were becoming the repositories of their family history. We can hardly compartmentalize stories of partition. Neither can we generalize the stories of all those who had witnessed the event. Despite the vast volume of information on partition that is available to us today, we are only just learning to view the event encompassing all its facets and countless individual narratives which are equally important. So Calcutta, since I am from West Bengal, I would like to highlight the condition in Calcutta. Calcutta was a very pristine city before partition. So all of the people who were living in Calcutta, they were vastly, they were devastated when partition struck. From the 1942, from the year 1942, people have been, experiencing changes in the economy, in the society, due to the Great Famine, which affected, it was a man-made famine, which affected Bengal. And people were suffering, there were economic crisis going on. And here in this picture, we can see the British troops in Calcutta with rifles at their ready, clearing a street after the Hindus and Muslims used firearms against each other. So there were frequent communal clashes which have been happening. This picture is from 28 August 1946. The bodies in the main thoroughfare of Calcutta after riots and disturbances, the communal riots which have been happening. There were deluge of bodies taking over empty spaces all over Calcutta, turning the pristine metropolis into a slum. Most of the people who have been living in Calcutta pre-partition, they kind of, they were very upset about it, and they continued to say that this could never have happened under the British. There was orderliness and discipline under the British. The streets were washed every day, and Calcutta was a very perfect city before the coming of the refugees. So partition did transform the city of Calcutta forever. The border between two nation states of India and Pakistan was formed just a few miles outside Calcutta. The moral order of the city had collapsed post 1946 because of the famine and the riots as well. 3/4 of the city's residents were Hindu, and 1/4 was Muslim, and it's not very different from what it is today. So, but the layout was very different. The Muslim pockets in the Hindu areas and the Hindu pockets in the Muslim areas, they were present there, and people lived in harmony before, the 1940s. But post-partition, we can see that the riots and the fear of the other, the religious other, which have been, conceptualized post-partition, this wreaked havoc. And in areas like Maniktala in Calcutta, the Hindus were greater in number, and in Park Circus, the Muslims were greater in number, resulting in communal clashes there. Various newspapers reported a huge number of human bodies thrown into the river Ganga and burnt around the clock. I would also like to this is I would like to mention the yes of Gandhi. Here we can see Gandhi touring Noakhali in 1946 as a part of his peace mission. So he was, going personally to the riot-afflicted villages, both in East and West Bengal, and this was a part of his peace mission. So he is being accompanied by his disciples here. So the interviews I took on behalf of Stanford University and Partition Archive, they left a very deep impact on me and my studies. So I would just quickly like to highlight a few interviews here. This is the interview of Mr. Dasgupta, Tapan Kumar Dasgupta. He was born in Borishal, Bangladesh, and he had to migrate to West Bengal in 1947. He was just 13. So during partition, Mr. Dasgupta's family lost their ancestral home, furniture, jewelries, and various other valuable assets. Mr. Dasgupta and his family broke down when they realized that they would not be able to call Borishal their home anymore. So most of the people who had to uproot themselves from East Bengal and come to West Bengal, they kind of felt that this is a pretty temporary thing, and they would eventually go back to their homes after a week or two, a month or two, very soon. But that hope was in vain, and they could not really go back to their homelands anymore. After several decades, they might have, gone to pay a visit to their homelands, but they could not call their homes anymore. So when I was interviewing Mr. Dasgupta, I could feel that this grief of uprooting themselves from their homelands had stayed with him till date. The second one is of Ananga Mohan Banerjee. He happens to be my grandfather. So he was born in West Bengal, and he did not migrate during partition, but he witnessed partition and the effect it had on Bengal. So here he recounts how the landowners hired the fishermen to fight on their behalf during the communal riots, using big chunks of stones and bricks stored on their terraces in preparation of the riots. The women of the household blew conch shells to spread awareness regarding the attacks in the neighborhoods. During the riots, his mentally disabled aunt had gone out of home, never to return. Mr. Banerjee's family believes that she was killed by a mob in the city during the riots. So these are the various, levels on which partition affected people, partition torn apart families, and whatnot. So this is these are stills from Meghe Dhaka Tara, a movie by Ritik Ghotok, which focuses on the experience of refugee women post 1947. This girl had to uproot from East Bengal and had to migrate to West Bengal along with her family. So she could not go on studying anymore. Obviously, she had to work now. She had to support her family, in whichever way it was possible. So this is basically a trilogy, 3 movies, chronologically focusing on the experiences of refugee families post-partition. I would also like to highlight the conceptualization of the word refugee and the figure and the image of a refugee, how it became a new addition in the vocabulary of middle-class Bengalis post-partition. A refugee was usually translated into culturally inferior, teased in schools, often physically taunted, and openly blamed for leaving everything behind and feeding on the jobs and resources of the original inhabitants of West Bengal. So the most important thing that I would like to hammer on is that the loss of homeland in case of the migrants was also accompanied by the sense of economic displacement and social insecurity. It's very difficult to talk about a subject as heavy as partition, and but if anyone wants to delve deeper into how it affected Bengal, both East and West Bengal, there is a plethora of partition literature which has been written in Bengali language and has been also translated into various other languages as well, and movies. So I have observed that nostalgia and sense of loss are the 2 major things that runs common through all of these. So I think we can never really get over how partition affected various parts of South Asia. And since I have talked about Bengal, how it affected Bengal, how it affected, both the public and the private spheres, and how it has been reflected in the literary works, the movies. I think these are very important aspects which needs to be discussed a lot more than we are doing now. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you, James, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share a space with all of you, and I really loved talking about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Srilagna, and I commend you on the work that you're doing in capturing as many of the memories and the stories from that traumatic period of the partition. So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to open up to a panel discussion. So I'm going to ensure that we can see all of our speakers. So please make sure that you've turned on your video cameras and your microphones. And I'm going to get the ball rolling with a question I've written down that I'd like to put forward to our speakers. Do you think that India, Pakistan and Bangladesh are owed reparations as a result of the British Raj? And if you do think so, what might that look like in practice? And if you don't think that Britain owes reparations, then I'd love to hear why. So we'll go in the same order as our presentations, but I would ask speakers, if you would like to really kind of get your opinion, please use the hand up feature, and I'll make sure that I come to you as well. So we'll start with Aftab. Does Britain owe reparations to Bangladesh?
Oh, I think Britain owes reparations to the entire Indian subcontinent, but in what context, how, is something that needs to be debated upon. I think one of the points that Srilagna mentioned is that, especially from a Bangladeshi context, I think psychologically people have put more emphasis on that period of Pakistan rule following the partition of the subcontinent, because it's closer to memory. And I think a demand for reparations, or at least an official apology from the Pakistani state, has remained present and more vocal over a demand for reparations against the British. And the reason I say this is because the legacy of British colonialism is so institutionalized in certain key structures of the Bangladesh story, particularly in how the education system was developed, particularly how the judicial system was developed, and how law enforcement services were developed, and how more specifically the civil bureaucracy was developed. So therefore, I think I say this with a little bit of discomfort that there is a perception amongst a certain group of people, even today, who were educated perhaps in Britain or received a British education, stating that, look, the Brits had left us with a lot of institutional tools that we can positively use to make Bangladesh a better place. But the problem that we see arising more recently is that the concerns that the nation has when it comes to democracy, when it comes to having electoral systems which are inclusive, when it comes to the judicial situation, all of that has its problems rooted deeply in British colonialism. And without sort of recognizing that or addressing that hands-on, both from a bottom-up and top-down perspective, the question of reparations, especially in a Bangladeshi context, becomes secondary. I think more specifically, more so than reparations, there needs to be a recognition that, especially from where I'm from, that the tools and systems that the British have left is simply not working for us. And it is the cause of most of the problems that we see, even amidst a period of increased economic growth and economic development. The barriers are British. And I feel looking at that, looking into those roots is perhaps more important than reparations. Reparations will come. Reparations are something that needs to be discussed, and reparations have been brought forward as a topic of discussion in recent years. But I do feel that we need to engage our policymakers in addressing the colonial systems more so as a primary means of addressing our concerns.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jalal, I'd like to pose the same question to you. Does Britain...
Well, I mean, I'm a historian, so and it's been very interesting hearing people give me history from different perspectives. And what's been totally missing in all the presentations is Indian agency.
Yeah.
And the question is that the British exploited, but what did the Indians do? The Indians collaborated and they resisted as well. So I think collaboration I haven't heard from anywhere. I mean, let's not forget that Jallianwala Bagh, those who shot were Indian. I mean, they were ordered to by a Brit, but those who did was an Indian. So, I mean, when you talk of reparations, minus any sense of responsibility of the post-colonial elite in perpetuating British idioms and structures, I don't think that is really valid, a valid argument. Reparations of the sort that you are thinking of, I mean, there's a big debate now in the case of the United States, and I think that has. I mean, in terms of whether it's a question of money or more symbolic, I think far more important for reparations, in the context of South Asia, is a decolonization of the mind across the board. But you have to realize that colonialism has made us what we are today. Whether it's the loss of languages, our Persian heritage. But what do you want to do with it? You have to accept what you've become and what you want to shun. So I think that can only come with critical thinking. And so for me, reparations are of the sort that they would have to be symbolic. I would much rather see ways in which Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis can lay claim to their artistic heritage, which is sitting in the British Museum. And I think there are a variety of other things that need to be done to make these objects more accessible to all of us, which are part of our heritage. One way to do it may be to do it sort of massively visually. But I do think that it's the decolonization process. It's an acknowledgement of the humiliation, the exploitation that has been suffered, and that needs to be acknowledged. But I'm not talking necessarily concretely about chunks of money being given, because nothing can repair what we've suffered under colonialism and what we have lost as a result. There is no way that the British can make up for it, but the least they can do is to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that sort of view around the reparations and decolonization specifically. Poonam, do you think that Britain owes reparations?
I think it owes the reparations to the world, and it's just started. Just to give it a very lighter note, I found a picture which I wanted to share with everybody and maybe have an opinion of what do they think of this picture, because I saw it when I was studying, but I saw it with Mahatma, and right now I went. And I also want to thank here on the video conference that we as students, we as people, citizens of our country, started thinking of reparations only after the speech of Shashi Tharoor, where he was a very, very strong voice and ignited us to think about what can be done for this. And this is a picture which kind of disturbed me, at the same time made me think maybe reparations are needed. Here it is. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see who it is? So I did not know what to really think about, because the backbone of our country is culture and the agriculture aspect. And as ma'am says, that a lot part of the cultural aspect is so much there in Britain, and the backbone of our country has been broken down. And the first thing that they should start off with is to acknowledge and to apologize. We did have a Pope, going to Jallianwala Bagh and apologizing for it. I do remember that very, very clearly. But there needs to be a pathway. There need to be discussions about how do we come together to bring about peace in the South Asian nations. And if we start off, I think we will be able to do it in some form or the other, even in the materialistic aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned that similar conversations around reparations in the Caribbean. At the top of the list of their kind of reparations plan is a formal apology, a form of acknowledgement. So it's interesting that that's also coming out here as well. Irfan, I'll ask you the same question. Does Britain owe reparations?
I strongly believe that if not a financial reparation, Britain, of course, and definitely owes a moral reparation. Like as Madam Aisha Jalal was saying, it will not repair anything, but still we can feel that the sacrifice or the pressure, the bad times that our forefathers have gone through, we see a moral apology from the current heads of the then imperialist rule of the world. So I strongly believe that. And also my friend Aftab, who was mentioning what the British had contributed through institutions and through other things. But when we really analyze those, for example, the greatest physical contribution of British colonization is the Indian railways. But we can understand the railways was expanded for the sole benefit of Britain to carry forward their goods to the ports and export it to England, and similarly to transport the bulk of military pockets to various parts of the subcontinent. So whatever they did as good to India, there has been a side which had benefited them like tremendously. So that's one thing. And one more thing is that there has been Indian contribution in fighting the World War, and British had promised the then Indian nationalists that there will be a kind of, I don't know what to say for that, I forgot, but a kind of reward, or like, I'm sorry, I'm missing that, but what the loss of life of Indian soldiers who have been fighting for the British, they have been given promise that it will be met by the British, but it had never been met. So in terms of that also, India and the other countries in the subcontinent owes a reparation. That's what I believe, James.
Thank you. Updesh, I'd like to ask you the same question. Does Britain owe reparations?
I mean, it's kind of a, so for me, I feel like I am a bit reluctant to say they owe financial reparations, simply because I'm like, who receives those finances? Who receives those monetary contributions? Corruption is rife within the entire region, and is money enough to pay for what has happened? Seeing that there still isn't any acknowledgement. I did very interestingly come across this idea that Britain's form of reparations to, let's say, specifically the Sikh community, is building memorials for fallen soldiers in the wars. And I says, but that's not necessarily reparations. That's just acknowledging the contributions of Sikh people in a war that had nothing to do with them. For me, I think reparations would be best in the form of helping build infrastructure in the region, but not just in India itself, but like, India, Pakistan, trying to improve the relations between the two countries, and even Bangladesh as well, try and just really connect the region itself with itself. Maybe also agitate for more autonomy for the different regions of India, so that the different peoples can all be represented more fairly, improve, the democratic processes in the region. But the real question is, can we trust the British to do any of that? And I feel like the easy answer is yes, Britain owes reparations. The difficult question is, how do we go about getting those reparations to where they're needed? And that's not just applicable to India, that's applicable to every single British colony out there.
Thank you very much. And yes, it's a very kind of hot question. It's growing in the Caribbean and in the Americas, as Dr. Jalal said earlier. And following on from Dr. Shashi Tharoor's speech in 2015, there are more conversations happening, at least in the Indian community. I'm not sure of any movements in Pakistan and Bangladesh, but I'd be interested to hear if they are taking this.
I mean, it's really interesting that there was one of the curators of the VNA museum was in Pakistan, and I happened to meet, and we started talking about all the artifacts that are sitting there. I mean, there is an opinion that says that it's probably better in Britain because you bring it to South Asia, and I mean, where the loss of artifacts has been a huge problem, the trade in artifacts illegal trade. But the answer that this curator gave me when I said, what about all that of South Asia? He said, Indians and Pakistanis have never asked for it. So here again, what I'm trying to tell you is that while we can blame the British for the rest of our lives, and they will carry that burden, I do think we need to, if we want to change our present situation, we need to turn our attention to those who have perpetuated the British system in post-colonial South Asia. Unless you do that, unless you undo the way of thinking, reparations will achieve nothing other than, as you pointed out, Bangladesh, that it will just go into some corrupt process. If we bring back artifacts, we can't even guarantee at this stage, given the lack of morality and the takeover of the market everywhere, whether these will be safe. But so that's why I think that I'm proposing a visual sharing, that we can access this on a constant basis whenever we need to. I think that's the best thing we can do with the technology now. I've been proposing this for a long time, but I do think that it would be a misstep for us. I mean, in the case of America too, reparations is a good rallying cry. But what is really needed is not money, but a recognition of the injustices, the continuing injustices, and to the removal of those. That's what I would press on more than. I mean, if you want to rally around reparations, fine, but the real issue is to move beyond the condition of coloniality. We are all colonial subjects still.
Thank you, Dr. Jalal. Sri Lagna, I just wanted to bring you in this conversation. How do you feel about reparations?
Yeah, I think all of us present here are on the same page regarding the fact that it is a moral reparation that the exploiters owe us and not financial one, really. So I think we're on the same page regarding that. But as Dr. Jalal has been done, and the level of trauma, the level of injustice that has been caused to the colonized, they can never be reparations in that case. But I think what is needed is dealing with the present, and how we look at what is happening in the present, how we can create more dialogues surrounding it, how we can make the present situation better. How that is a question which is for bigger people to decide upon the policies and all those aspects. But as students and as those who are living in the present, I do strongly feel that it is the present that we need to talk about, and we don't need to keep hammering what has been happened, and we definitely memorize. I mean, we can't let go of the memories. It has been so deeply in memories in that sense, in our recalls. So that is that. And even like post-partition, the women who have been abducted and raped, affected in some way during partition, most of them had to move with their abductors to the other countries. Most women from India had to move to Pakistan with their abductors, and in many cases we have seen that marry their abductor, so they have been uprooted twice. Once they were being uprooted homeland by the abductors and have been moved to another country where they have been settled, and they were kind of building a family life. And post partition, the Indian government decided to bring these women back to their homelands, again from their families, the new families that they have been creating. So this is how many times can you in an individual. So I think this is something that we need to think about. So yeah, reparations in that sense, we need to talk more, we need to indulge in the dialogues more and deal with the present. So yeah, that's what I feel.
Thank you very much. Arti, I believe that you have some questions for our speakers.
Well, thank you, James. So I must say that I really enjoy listening today. You all really presented some, thought-provoking content. And we do have a question from the YouTube comment section from our audience. So this is a general question for our speakers living in diasporic communities. So anyone please feel free to answer. So someone asked, are indigenous communities in Western countries reevaluating the impact that Western powers had on the people they conquered? So anyone feel free to respond.
It's the Indian communities, the Indian diaspora. Are you sort of mentioning that? I think it's much more complex. If you look at the US situation and India, the diasporic community, I can only give you an anecdotal sort of explanation of what this is. Students of mine who come from India are concerned about poverty, injustice, and all that's wrong, with caste discrimination. These are the issues that they want to talk about. And the ones from here, they just want to present a wonderful image of India. They want to have culture, they want to have movies, they don't want to hear about politics, they don't want to hear about injustice. They don't want, so the point is, how is the diasporic community helping matters? I think the diasporic community of a particular kind wants to sort of, hitch its wagons to a narrative of greatness, of India's greatness. I think that's what's happening, and that's exactly missing the point of what needs to be done. So I'm not so sure. I'm not denying that there are diasporic communities who think otherwise, but by and large, the general drift tends to be, at least I'm talking about the US, I'm sure the British diaspora is much more complex. But here, if you take the Howdy Modi event here that took place a few years ago, you'll see where the diaspora is in the context of India. So I just wanted to add that. I don't deny that there are others in Europe and everywhere else, but I think you can't forget this aspect of the diaspora.
Thank you very much.
I think I just wanted to quickly add to that, across, especially from where I'm from, right? In Bangladesh, you've seen two groups of people who are actually moving to, say, Canada, Europe, America, etc. One group being people like me, in students, and I resonate with what Professor Jalal is saying. I talk about social issues and I want to discuss about the items that I feel are affecting Bangladesh negatively. And these are younger people who are coming in here who want to see a difference in the way institutions in particular operate in our countries, and institutions with a colonial history. How do we address that? How do we change that? How do we take ownership of structures that were left by colonial regimes? We haven't done that in the last 40 years. We have not done that in the sense that our political powers or our political leadership has sort of continued to exploit its citizens, if I might say that, using colonial era rules and tools. So I think that's something that's important. You have a group of people who are coming here who are talking about those situations, but at the same time, you have the Howdy Modi crowd as well, as Dr. Jalal said. You are here, people who are moving, who are benefiting from the economic enhancement that Bangladesh has made, coming here, purchasing properties, multiple properties, and using Canada, Europe, America as locations to promote brand Bangladesh, and doing so in a way which is not really keeping in touch with the realities of what's going on the ground. So I think there's two angles, two lenses, and I want to sort of emphasize what Dr. Jalal said at the point. Decolonization, I think, is a mindset, and it's time to take ownership of your own nations and own countries and own societies, because the Brits are not going to come and solve everything for you.
That's right.
doing that by recognizing and addressing the systematic flaws that they left, moving beyond that, moving beyond those power structures, moving beyond those hierarchies is the challenge that I think we need to undertake as we mature as developing countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Aftab. Arti, were there any more questions for our speakers from the comment section, or any questions that you had yourself?
Okay, that is the only question I'm seeing here right now in the comment section, but I do have a question for Ahmed. I'm sorry if I pronounced it incorrectly. In your presentation, you spoke about the growing movement for people to educate themselves on the British colonial roots of the legal structure in Bangladesh. And I was wondering if you can expound on this a bit.
Sure, I'll try. Okay, so I think over the past 10 to 15 years, and I think I can take this further back, every time a political regime has come to power, whether this be through military dictatorships or whether this be through democratically elected governments, there has been a tendency to tap into archaic and colonial laws to suppress any and all forms of dissent. Now, the decision to suppress dissent remains with the people of my country. That is not a decision that the Brits took after 1971 or the Pakistanis took after 1971. The decisions were taken by my elected or unelected leadership.
That's right.
And they have taken those decisions at the backdrop of legislative and legal tools and systems which were left by the British. And this is where I point out things like the Digital Security Act, enacted in 2018 to suppress dissent and to curb any and all forms of journalistic freedom. Now, what that has done in a country like Bangladesh, is a small country, 160 million people, very strong journalistic body. You've seen an increasing tone of self-censorship amongst the media as well. So the couple of things that I have noticed in my personal research is, number one, when it comes to human rights cases or cases of police, for example, undertaking operations which are pretty unconstitutional in nature, they have reverted back to British colonial era laws, which are still very much present in the constitutional structure. You are seeing that when it comes to cases of rape. The definition of rape, for example, hasn't changed since 1860, which is abhorrent. Like, what's going on there? It's been 200 years and you are still determining whether a person gets raped or not on the basis of a colonial era law from 1860. My leadership has decided to undertake that responsibility. So in that context, I see case to case, whether it be media freedom, whether it be issues of rape cases, whether it be concerns regarding the use of law enforcement agency as additional arms or branches of political regimes. You are seeing a conversation at the very least regarding why reform is integral, institutional reform is integral and part and parcel of a process of decolonization. But the problem is I'm not seeing that from the political leadership that has run my country in the last 50 years. And that is a cause of concern. Let's just put it that way. Yes.
Thank you very much, Aftab. And we will begin wrapping up our event now. So what I would like to do is go around each speaker and ask you to provide a 30-second summary. Was the British Raj a positive overall or a negative? Sri Lagna, I'll start with yourself.
I think we are past the mentality where, people used to think that the British has done a lot of good to us. They have built roads, they have brought in the trains, they have industrialized our country to a certain extent. So it has, we are learning to probe much deeper into the question that you're asking. And it's definitely a negative, a negative point of view that we are seeing, perspective that we are seeing here. And as I said, that since I am interested in public history and I have been interviewing the witnesses, so I have felt that partition or the British colonization have affected people on a very, very, intimate and detailed and, a very specific way, and on various layers. So we have to travel a long way until we get out of it, and take ownership of ourselves or our actions, or the flaws that British left us, as Aftab said. So yeah, that's what it is. Thanks.
Thank you, Sri Lagna. Irfan, in a summary, best a summary as you can, was the British Raj a good thing or a negative thing overall?
I would go on with the same opinion which my previous speaker mentioned. Like, the time has gone. To summarize that point, like, I strongly believe that India or any other countries in our subcontinent would have prospered more if the colonization didn't happen by any chance, or if British didn't come. As Shashi Tharoor rightly said, we were contributing, the undivided India was contributing 24% to the global GDP at the time when they came, and it was less than 2% when they left. So it's such a deficit between that. And again, one more quick thing I wanted to join with the view of Aisha ma'am, that there has been collaborators and people who made real the occupation or the authoritarian rules which the colonial powers were implementing, and we have to acknowledge that. There is no doubt. We have to acknowledge that, and let's see if something good comes up. Thank you.
Thank you. Poonam, can you please summarize, was the British Raj a positive or negative thing overall? You're on mute. Thank you.
It definitely was negative. And till the time we keep looking back and thinking of the past, we will not be able to find solution for the present. Having known that it was highly negative, that we are having discussions till date to find solutions in itself, makes us understand and realize that our slavery in our minds hasn't left us. Somewhere acceptance, somewhere forgiveness, and somewhere to make peace corridors, it's very important. And to expect this out of political systems would be stupidity, because political systems completely are deeply economic systems. They would want to have wars when it's needed. They would want to do what's good for their own countries. But there has to be collaborations within the South Asian countries to come together and say that we need peace. I've had an example when I visited Dubai. Then there was a person who wanted to meet a grandchild and couldn't see the grandchild who's living in India. There was a person from Pakistan for almost 15 years. Little movements, little corridors, little bit of peace, not brooding over the past, but trying to find solution by collaborative efforts, which are not necessarily political, would be an answer. So we need to look forward and forgive the past, but not forget it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poonam. Updesh, has British Raj left an overall positive or negative legacy?
I don't know how else to say this, but empire was bad. Like, it's a very simple answer. I think everybody has already articulated pretty well. Would we still see the problems that we have in the subcontinent specifically, if we contextualize the question specific to the continent? No, I don't think we'd see the same problems, especially from my community in Punjab. I don't think you would see such a animosity between our community and the government of India if the British Raj was never to have existed. I feel like any positives that have come from Raj has always been to the benefit of the British first, and then as a secondary benefit to the people that they've subjugated. So yeah, overall, I think the only positive thing that I can think of that would be a result from British Raj would be probably the creation, or like the the facilitation of the diaspora, in the sense that people have congregated in Britain, the multiculturalism that is here, where different communities from all over the world have interacted with each other and there's a cultural exchange. However, I do want to caveat that is completely possible without the brutality of empire. So even then, even as that positive, I'm really reaching there. And I think, yeah, overall, I don't feel bad in saying the British Raj was terrible for the Indian people.
Thank you, Abdesh. Dr. Jalal, was the British Raj a positive or negative overall?
I mean, there's just no question that it was negative. I mean, let's not forget that in 1800, India and China together accounted for over 50% of the global GDP. So I don't think that we have to. I mean, today it's something like. I mean, it's much lower. So I mean, and let's not forget the 19th century of humiliation for China. So colonial empires have had a very negative impact. But my concern today is with the post-colonial form of the nation state, which has imbibed all the ideas, the idioms and structures of the colonial state. Ideas like sovereignty, non-negotiable, monolithic, and in a subcontinent that's had a history of federal issues. If you have a non-negotiable sovereignty, you will have a million mutinies, to use Naipaul's problematic, depiction of that. But that's the name of his book. So I think that there's just no question in my mind that it has had a negative impact. For a variety of reasons. But I also think that realistically speaking, South Asians have to understand that our problems of what we have become is a historical result. And how much of it can change and how much of it cannot change. To give you an example, the British introduced the idea of territory and identity being somehow merging. Prior to them, the idea, there was no religious distinction. It was merit. And yes, in the Persianate, Indo-Persian world, the emperor was the embodiment of sovereignty, personalized sovereignty. But there was no religiously based difference. That's what the British introduced. And I think that has been the bane of South Asia, our misconception that somehow we are divided by religion. But actually religions don't divide so much as narrow-minded nationalist politics. This is what has destroyed the subcontinent and its federal potential. So I would say that the British had wanted to create a unified subcontinent, but they ended up creating a unitary state, which even in its federal iteration, as India claims to be, has remained a unitary state. And that is the problem that we have to still deal with. And this is true of Pakistan as well. And I think from what I'm hearing, Aftab, pretty much Bangladesh, even though Bangladesh comes out so much better than these two countries on social indicators, is also suffering from the same. And I would like to add Sri Lanka as well. If we're talking about the British Empire, we can't leave Sri Lanka out. So if you look at the problems they have left, those are the real sort of symbols of what was negative about colonialism in South Asia and beyond.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jalal. And the final.
Thank you. Thank you for having us for this very, very interesting. And thank you, all of you. I enjoyed listening to you. I think you're very thoughtful, and please carry on your excellent work. So thank you. All the best.
Thank you. And our final summary, Aftab, did the British Raj leave a positive or negative legacy overall? Thank you.
Undeniably negative legacy. I don't think that is an issue of contention, but in my perspective, echoing the words of Dr. Jalal and pretty much everyone else, the legacy of British colonialism lies in how we as post-colonial societies are deciding to run our countries. Right. I think we cannot ignore that at all. The issues that we face today, whether it be cases of sectarianism, corruption, institutional corruption, an archaic bureaucracy, a public sector which is lacking innovation, etc. That all boils down, I believe, to the legacy of colonialism that we've decided to carry forward as nation states for the benefits of a handful of people who have ruled their countries respectively, certain families, certain political parties, and byproducts of their systems. So I think in a nutshell, the thing that we have to address is taking on and reforming the institutions that the Brits have left. And that is the only way that you will truly be able to progress with purpose. Otherwise, the legacy of colonialism will keep harming the social fabrics of our nations and also create a multilateral systems of problems that you see today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aftab, and thank you to all of our speakers for joining us and delivering presentations and taking part in the panel discussion. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us, and I'd like to remind you that even if you have questions after this, please get in touch with the Association of Former British Colonies, and perhaps even the speakers that you have heard today, that you'll be inspired to reach out to them, to contact them, to learn more, to further your own knowledge, and to decolonize your mind, as is a theme that we've discussed today. So that's it from us. Thank you very much to all our speakers, and thank you to our audience, and look forward to future events.